Okay, today we're going to talk about the evolution of the Latin American colonies mostly in the 1600s and the first half of the 1700s. So we're going to talk specifically about the Spanish Empire's economic problems, especially in the 1600s, and then we'll go into some more specific colonial case studies, different areas of the Spanish and Portuguese Empire in the 1600s, and the big change that happens, especially with the Spanish Empire in the early 1700s, as a result of the so-called War of the Spanish Succession, and how the new government that came into office as a result of that war will start making colonial reforms in the early 1700s. And the last part will go back to Brazil and talk about its mining boom in the early 1700s and how that affected the Brazilian economy's development up until about 1750 or so. So, first section is about the Spanish Empire's economic problems. So, the Spanish Empire has quite a lot of economic problems in the 1600s. The first one is really a result of the economic damage that was done when the Spanish first conquered the major native empires, especially the Aztec and the Inca, in the early 1500s. So the ramifications of those conquests are still having massive results for the colonial economy, even well over 100 years later. So first big problem is that the conquest caused a population collapse of the Native American empires, largely through diseases like smallpox, major epidemics that we've seen before just wiped out a massive number of the natives that were living in the areas before the Spanish showed up. Another major problem of the conquest economically is that it really destroyed a lot of the native specialized labor groups. So what advanced technology or what specialized crops or whatever they had produced before the Spanish showed up, a lot of those production methods were lost or destroyed because when the Spanish conquered the area, they forced a lot of those specialized native laborers into general farm labor on the encomiendas. So that destroyed a lot of the kind of advanced specialized technological labor that the natives have built up in whatever area you're talking about. It also destroyed a lot of the population centers and the production centers of the native empires. So the conquest, largely they went after the big cities, which of course had the most people in them and therefore had the most economic activity, the most native economic production going on. And a lot of that production as a system was destroyed by the Spanish when they tried to conquer the city in the first place. Another major problem is that the natives moved goods around before the conquest through kind of trade and community groups that would travel from one area to another. And again, the Spanish conquest largely at least disrupted, if not outright destroyed, a lot of those trade groups or kind of interregional movement groups that were moving goods and services around their empires. It did a lot less damage to those kind of specialized labor and trading networks in Brazil because the area that would become Brazil, the Portuguese Empire, simply their natives didn't have a lot of the specialized labor and trade networks that the Inca and the Aztec did. So there wasn't as much of an economic collapse after the Portuguese came in and conquered the place because there wasn't a lot of developed economy to collapse. And again, another major problem for all this is that the Europeans, their view of the colony is that it is a kind of source for money to mine and pull out, to suck out all the resources that they possibly can out of the Americas. So the European economic system in the colonies was not built to reinvest profit to build further economic growth for the long term. The whole system was built to extract wealth from the Americas and bring it back to Spain and Portugal or whatever European colonist is involved to benefit the Europeans as much as possible. So it's very short-term, kind of short-sighted economic policy. Another major problem, especially for the Spanish Empire, is just simple over-reliance on one economic sector, and eventually that would become the mining and sugar industries. in the Spanish areas. So either way, if you have a whole region of your economy is very heavily dependent and focused on either mining or sugar or really any other industry, whenever you get a fluctuation in the prices for those goods, that could do a lot of economic damage if the price goes down to an entire region. And of course, if the price goes up, it could benefit the region. But it's a big, big risk to have too much of your economy focused on just one product or one area. And eventually, the regional economies will try to diversify, as the economists call it. They'll try to get involved in the production of other goods in order to kind of hedge against the possible price collapse or the price downturn of sugar or any of the kind of mining things that they're doing. Another major problem that the Spanish faced is that several of their largest cities in their colonies face the Pacific Ocean, which means that they do not face the Atlantic Ocean. They're kind of on the other side of the continents, the western side of the continents. So the big capital cities at the viceroyalties, especially in a kind of modern day Mexico City and in Lima in modern day Peru, they had to those were the big population centers of those colonies. So if they're going to access international markets, they have to move their goods overland to get to ports on the Atlantic Ocean, or at least facing the coastline that could get you to the Atlantic Ocean, which was just really costly and very difficult. So it was extremely expensive to move goods out of Lima and to get them to the Atlantic Ocean for export into the Atlantic world, largely Europe and maybe West Africa. And same thing with Mexico City, even though it's closer to the kind of Caribbean Sea, the Caribbean region coastline, the goods still had to be moved overland just to get to the coastline, because Mexico City is fairly far inland. So that is extremely expensive. You have to pay a lot of workers to move the goods, and because they're moving through areas where they might be robbed, they have to hire guards. They have to bring food with them because it's several days of a trip. They have to have large animals and wagons and whatnot to move the goods. So it's extremely expensive, which of course drives up the price that sellers of those goods have to achieve at market wherever they actually sell this stuff in Europe or wherever else. They have to raise their prices to pay for that increased cost of transportation, which harms their competitiveness with goods that are made in Europe. And it also limited the types of goods that the colonies could produce and try to sell in the Atlantic world, in Europe and everywhere else. So the goods that the colonies could produce, since it took several days to move them overland to get to the port to export to wherever they're going, those goods largely had to be non-perishable. They could not be crops, they could not be food-based things, because the food might rot before you get it to the ocean, and definitely before you get it on a boat and travel it to Europe for a month, the food could go bad, it could spoil. So a lot of the colonies would have to focus on non-perishable items like textiles, things made out of cloth or clothing or sails for ships or something like that. Gold or silver were easier to move because they wouldn't spoil. And a lot of times sugar, you can keep sugar for really quite a while, even back then, much longer than you can keep other types of farm agricultural based products. So a lot of the colonial areas, especially the ones that faced the Pacific side, their economic growth was mostly due to the original conquest and the construction of new mines. That drove their economic growth in the kind of mid 1500s. But by the time you get to the year 1600 and into that century, that economic growth will start to slow down and eventually collapse. And even the goods that they could get to the ports and ship out to Europe and bring European goods back, there's often a lot of smuggling involved, and there's price competition with European-made goods, so it does a lot of economic damage in the long term. Another major problem is that the Spanish government policy to control colonial production and trade was to sell monopoly rights, exclusive government contracts to the consulados, which are basically groups of merchants, like a merchant's guild, almost like a merchant's union. So these merchant guilds, these groups of merchants, would basically come to control a lot of the colonial trade because they bought up the monopolies that the government put out for sale. And the consulados, their general policy is to try to control the colonial economy as much as they possibly can and to set exchange rates, basically price rates, exchange for trade, for different types of goods in order to guarantee their own personal profit, because I mean these consulados, these guys are running their own private companies, so that's how they got enough money to buy the monopoly right in the first place. And now that they have the monopoly right, they're trying to use it to increase their profits even further. So that does a lot of good things for the consulados themselves. They get very rich off of this stuff, but it does a lot of bad things for virtually all the other people that are involved in colonial trade. Any other merchants that would try to compete or would want to compete or get into the market at all, it's very difficult because it's a monopoly. And because the consulados and any companies that are involved in this trade, they are looking to make as much money as they possibly can, obviously, just like any other business. So trade is the most profitable thing. So whenever a company makes a lot of money off of a boat moving into Europe and selling off its goods, they would not take that money and invest in other types of ventures in the colonies. They would just take that profit and try to reinvest in their own merchant business so they can import 2 boatloads next time instead of just 1 and make even more money. So that meant that the profit that was being made off of the Spanish colonial trade was not being reinvested into other types of businesses in the colonies themselves. So there is a lack of investment capital basically flowing around in the colonies. The money that's moving around in the colonies is being taken out of the colonies and brought back to Europe. So even if you have a good idea for a business, or you have some kind of market that you think that you can make money off of, you often cannot get loans to start the business because there's just not a whole lot of free capital floating around looking for business ventures, opportunities. So that did a lot of long-term damage to the colonies' economic development throughout the 1600s. And another government policy that starts to emerge even in the 1500s that did a lot of damage was that the Spanish government, as we've talked about before, wants to really control its American colonial trade as closely as possible. So they passed this big law in 1503 that set up what came to be known as the House of Trade, the Casa de Contratacion. So that meant that any goods that came out of the Americas have to be on ships that cannot stop anywhere until they go to Seville, one of the big cities in Spain, for official offloading and tax payments on the goods. And that's what the House of Trade became known as. It was like the official clearinghouse, basically, for incoming American products into Spain. So again, that's where the products, the kind of invoices on the ships were counted up and made sure that they were official and the taxes on the goods were paid. And then after they were offloaded, they could be kind of dispersed out into the Spanish economy for sale, or they could be put back on the boat and sent. The boat would go somewhere else, wherever its final destination is for whatever market they're trying to achieve. Seville, though, became kind of overloaded with the amount of trade that was happening because it was the only legal place to do it. By about the year 1700 or so, it's just a gigantic amount of traffic of boats coming in and out of the city, to the point that the city could not handle it by the year 1700. So the House of Trade was eventually relocated to Cadiz, an even bigger city, in 1717, hoping that that would make the process work more efficiently. But again, this is a trade restriction that reduces the amount of growth of the colonial economy. A lot of economists argue if those boats were allowed to offload in many different places, that more goods could be processed faster, therefore more goods could be traded, which means the economy could grow. And again, one of the big problems we keep coming back to with Spain and Portugal is that when you just look at the size on this map of Spain and Portugal way over on the right side, their countries are very small compared to the amount of land that they're trying to control in the Americas. So in the end, Spain and Portugal, they just didn't have the amount of population, the men, the tax collectors, the soldiers, to really run an economy this large that dominates two entire other continents. So they just didn't have the resources to try to control these vast areas that they're laying claim to. And again, smuggling starts to get out of control, and you get piracy and all these other kinds of things. But the government tried, and they tried for really several hundred years to control it, and in the end, they just didn't have the resources to control it that closely. So the Spanish colonies trade really declines and goes into a collapse type phase in the early 1600s. Will recover, especially with a kind of smuggling boom that gets going in the really kind of 1620s, 1630s. But then they'll go into another era of economic stagnation, lack of growth in 1640, and they will stay in that kind of lack of growth type area into the 1700s. So now we'll get into some kind of colonial case studies. We talked about just generally what's going on, especially in the Spanish Empire, and now we'll talk about some localities specifically. So in the Spanish Empire, the Viceroyalty of Peru, this whole area along the western coastline of South America, their economy is very, very heavily dependent on the mining trade. So going in and basically digging out gold and silver out of whatever places they can find it. And the biggest silver mine is at a place called Potosi, which you see kind of more in the southern area on this map, right below the word Charcas. So Potosi was the biggest silver mine. It became known as the Cerro Rico, the rich hill, basically. And the mine at Potosi could support a whole regional economy around it because they were pulling so much silver out of it. It was so profitable. So that mine supported a whole regional economy because the workers in the mine needed to be supplied with food, clothes, work animals to help pull the resources back and forth. They needed housing. They needed kind of an official government in that area to oversee all this and enforce laws and everything. So the Potosi silver mine could support a regional economy in the kind of area around the mine, but it was very, very difficult for the silver mines to support an entire colonial economy throughout the entire viceroyalty. So you'll eventually get the creation of smaller scale production for other things that become known as obrajes. So they are basically kind of small scale mills that are built to produce goods in localities. So they often produce textile goods, clothing, cloth-based goods. They're usually not very technologically advanced. They are not industrialized as we would think of it today. As you can see in the picture, it took a worker somewhere attached to the mill to kind of turn a lathe or turn a crank that would power the mill and keep the little machines running. So they're not terribly kind of technologically advanced in any way. So they're largely a kind of ancient type production style, but there's some advancements there. The obrajes, they were supposed to employ free labor by law. So the workers in these little mills were supposed to be paid kind of hourly or daily wages for their work. But a lot of the mill owners tried to use debt peonage to really control the workers or some other type of coercion, even possible violent coercion if necessary, sometimes in extreme cases. But the owners, just like factory owners today, are trying to get away with paying their workers as little as possible. So they use the peonage system to trap their workers in debt, or they use other types of intimidation to pay their workers as little as possible so that the mill owners could keep as much of the profit for themselves as they possibly could figure out how to do. Especially if we kind of go back to the map real quick. Lima is the big city in the Viceroyalty of Peru. That's the capital city. And Lima kind of serves as the export place for a lot of the goods that are produced or mined in the whole Viceroyalty. So a lot of those goods traveled to Lima first and put on boats, and they were kind of exported from there. So, but again, because of the fleet system and Lima is on the Pacific side, the Lima market did not have a whole lot of European goods consistently coming into the Viceroyalty to have kind of price competition with the domestically made goods inside the Viceroyalty, the colony itself. So the Europeans aren't really importing a whole lot of things that the colonists cannot make for themselves. So the albraje system is fairly successful for a while until the kind of economy has opened up a little bit and European boats can get into the area much more reliably, much more consistently. So talking specifically about the Potosi mine, Potosi silver production largely boomed. It kept on increasing in that particular mine through 1591 and then collapsed after that year and stayed really at the lower level, the collapse level, right up into the early 1700s. So that's about 100 years or so of mine stagnation in this place. And again, this is the biggest and most successful silver mine in all the Spanish Empire. So the regional economy boomed with the growth of the mine up through 1591. And the regional economy around the Rich Hill did very well through that year. There's not a whole lot of market competition. Prices are fairly low. So the people in that area, not just the miners themselves that might be paid a little bit for the work, but the merchants in the area are making good money as long as the mine keeps growing. So after the mine kind of stagnates after 1591, then prices start to rise and merchants get squeezed a little bit more, and the economy, the regional economy, starts to struggle a whole lot. And once the mine kind of goes into its like collapse type phase, that basically destroyed the whole regional market. And with fewer workers in the mine, that means that there's less demand for any merchant products that are moving into the area. There's less demand for food and housing and clothing and the things of daily life basically that people use on a daily basis. So the whole regional economy around Potosi goes into a major recession and stays in recession for about 100 years. The merchants, though, because they're wealthy enough, they can move money around fairly easily, so they'll look for better investments in other places. So the merchants largely pulled out of the Potosi area. So the merchants continue to do fairly well because they can move their investments around to different colonies or different areas. They can move them into the Caribbean or wherever to find the best profit that they can. So usually when we have these economic stagnations, it's largely the kind of average workers, the poor, and especially the natives in these regions that are hit the hardest because they can't move around as well as merchant companies can move their businesses around. So just like today, it's much easier to move businesses and money around to seek the best investment, and they often leave the workers behind when they pull out of an area. The New Spain economy up around Mexico City and what is today Mexico did much better for two big reasons than the Viceroyalty of Peru, the western coastline of South America. Number one is that the New Spain economy was much more diversified by the time the kind of economic stagnation of the mines started. So the mines are actually located further away from the population centers in New Spain. And that meant that workers had to travel a little bit further from the population center to go to work or to go live in the area where the work was, which required the workers had to be paid more to go do that because they're leaving their hometowns basically, and they're traveling long distances. So they demanded higher wages, and because they're making more money, that means they have more disposable income to send back to relatives in the original population center, and so those relatives can buy more goods with that extra money, which means that there's a wider variety of goods for sale because there's more money moving around, which means that the whole economy, the regional economy, is much more diversified than the Viceroyalty of Peru or the Potosi mine region in South America. And also, the Mexico City and largely the New Spain colony is much more heavily connected to the Caribbean trade market and the European markets. Because if you just look at the map, I mean, Mexico City and the Viceroyalty of New Spain is largely along the Caribbean coastline. So they can get their goods on boats much easier and access the Caribbean islands for trade, or they can take those boats and send them to Europe or other areas where they want to trade. Whereas the Viceroyalty of Peru, they're kind of stuck on the Pacific coastline, so they don't have nearly as good access to the rest of the world trade markets. So the New Spain economy would be much more diversified, much more varied, and they are not nearly as heavily monopolized because there's a lot of more opportunity for boats to go in and out of the region. The downside for New Spain, though, is that the obrajes that get located in New Spain, these kind of local production mills, they struggle because European goods can access their markets much easier. So being along the coastline and having access to the Caribbean and the Atlantic kind of cut both ways. It's a two-edged sword. They have a lot of more opportunities for trade with the rest of the world, but they also have a lot more opportunities for that world to bring goods into their colony. So a lot of the obrajes in New Spain really struggle because Europeans can make goods often cheaper, even with the transportation costs across the ocean. The transportation cost across the ocean to get those products into New Spain, they can often do that and still sell their products for lower prices than the local obrajes can produce those goods at. And the European goods were usually much better quality, so anyone at the market could have a choice between buying something that was made in their own local region where the price was higher and the quality was worse, or they can buy something made in Europe and just import it in where the quality is much better and the price is lower. So for those types of buyers, those consumers, the choice is usually pretty easy, just like choices for consumers today in that same circumstance. They would almost always choose the product that is cheaper and better at the same time. So New Spain's obrajes, they cannot really compete with the goods that the Europeans will import into New Spain. So the obrajes that do well or survive that competition are usually the ones that make the goods that are not being imported by Europeans. So the goods that the local population rely on. So the obrajes usually make kind of cheaper goods for the poorer workers of the area who can't even afford to buy stuff that was made and imported from Europe. All right, and going down now to Brazil, the Portuguese colony in Brazil will largely be totally dominated by sugar, especially after about 1580 or so. So, I mean, Brazil is largely a sugar-based economy after the year 1580 and would continue being so through the 1600s. So even when sugar prices went down, the Brazilian economy will continue focusing on sugar. Brazil sugar plantations were almost always along the coastline. So that really restricted the colony's growth because you can see Brazil has a very long coastline, and because they are producing the profitable things that they can really right off the bat in the areas they've already colonized, the Brazilian economy doesn't grow very much in the 1600s. So the sugar prices remain low, and getting into the sugar production scheme was very expensive. It had very high investment cost. You had to get the land. You had to buy slaves largely to do the work for you, um, because the land was so kind of large. It was such a large territory that the person who bought the land, they and their family couldn't grow the sugar cane themselves on all that land. So they bought up a bunch of slaves. They also have to buy tools, and they either have to make a sugar refining mill themselves, or they have to sign kind of deals with a local refiner to refine their sugar, which is costly. So the investment costs for getting into the sugar market in Brazil were very high. And since the sugar prices at market were fairly low, that meant that the sugar plantations that got going, they would dedicate virtually all of their land that they owned or controlled to producing sugar. So that meant that they did not produce a whole lot of food or other goods for themselves. So Brazil, they will have to import food from other colonies or from other world markets, other producers, because their own farmland in Brazil itself is almost 100% dedicated to making as much sugar as they can. And of course, when they're oversupplying the market with all this sugar, that just keeps the prices low for the long term. And like most other colonies that we've talked about, it's really the merchants who profit most off this colonial trade in Brazil. The sugar producers, they make profit, but they don't make really astronomical profit because their investment costs were so high. So it's really the merchants that are bringing the food and other goods into the colony and selling it. They're the ones, again, that are making most of the money off of these colonies. Brazil will expand further in the 1690s, so very late in the 1600s, when gold will be discovered further inland away from the coastlines. So that will inspire or motivate the population to start moving further and further inland to colonize more territory. And once they start doing that, they will start needing more supplies and more workers and whatnot, and that will grow their colonial economy. So, and when there are especially gold discoveries further inland away from the coastline, more people start moving into those areas to look for gold and try to get rich off the gold. But it also grew all of South America's kind of unified economy, because a lot of those people going into the interior will start making initial contacts with the Spanish Empire that's getting to be right next door as Brazil expands further west. And once that happens, you're going to start seeing a kind of exchange, a trade, buying and selling between the Portuguese Brazilian colonists and the Spanish Peruvian or Viceroyalty of Peru colonists along the western coastline. And they'll start to make and trade goods just among themselves without the Europeans getting involved. And historians will say that this starts to cause some of the earliest instances of a purely domestic South American market. But that, again, takes much later, and that doesn't even start until the very late 1600s. And the next section is talking more about kind of European politics and how this will have an impact on the colonial economies in the 1700s. And a lot of this starts off with the Spanish king who's on the throne dies in the year 1600. His name is Charles II. He had a lot of medical problems, a lot of physical problems, basically. Most historians believe because a lot of the kind of interbreeding amongst the royal families in Europe that was had been going on for even centuries. So Charles II did not have any heirs. He did not have any children. So when he dies in the year 1700, that throws open a very large debate over who's going to inherit the Spanish throne and the gigantic American colonial system that goes along with the Spanish throne. So the big contender is a relative of the French king. So this guy is the grandson of Louis the XIV, who is by far the most powerful European monarch. Louis XIV is the King of Spain, which in the late 1600s, the King of Spain is known as the Arbiter of Europe. He is the one who kind of controls Europe to the extent that anyone else does. He's overtaken the Spanish monarchs as the most powerful country and therefore the most powerful ruler in the whole European world and probably in the whole world. Louis XIV is extremely powerful. He starts a lot of wars in the late 1600s and has conquered a lot of outlying territory for France. So France is seen as constantly expanding and gaining more and more power in the late 1600s under Louis XIV. And Louis is still alive in the year 1700. So going back to the first slide, when Charles II died, the Spanish king died, his will basically had designated Louis XIV's grandson, named Philip, to be the inheritor of the Spanish Empire, the Spanish throne. And that scared a whole lot of European leaders, because going back to the map again, if you look at this, just looking at the map, France and Spain are two of the biggest territorial countries in Europe. And France is the most powerful country already in Europe in the late 1600s. And Spain has this gigantic American empire. So if those two were somehow combined into one monarchy, they could really rule at least Europe, if not much of the rest of the world directly. So the idea that Louis XIV's grandson is now going to be King of Spain scared a lot of these other European leaders who think that the grandson is just going to follow orders from France. And a lot of the other European leaders get together and they form an alliance to stop it, to stop that guy from getting to the Spanish throne. And this conflict will become known as the War of the Spanish Succession. And it really gets going after a couple of years of negotiations. So the war starts in 1702, and this war goes for 11 more years. It doesn't end until 1713, and it involves almost all of the major European powers of the time. So England is involved, the Dutch are involved, the Austrians are involved, a bunch of the German areas kind of here in this whitish type open space, they're involved. And obviously France and Spain are involved. So this is a gigantic European-wide war. And it's all over trying to stop, basically, the French king from really taking over Spain and its empire. But Philip is officially crowned the Spanish king, and he therefore becomes known as Philip V in Spain. He had to rely on French forces, French soldiers, to come into Spain to keep him on the throne. So a lot of Spanish people, Spanish landowners and the Spanish population didn't like that this was happening, and they start looking for opportunities to revolt. And so Philip always has to have a French army in Spain to keep him in power, to keep him from being overthrown. And that French army even conquered and occupied the capital city at Madrid for several years. So Philip has to make a lot of promises to get those forces and keep them in Spain, to keep him on the throne. And the big promise he really makes is to allow French companies and French traders to access Spain's colonial markets. So the Spanish elite, the wealthy Spanish landowners and investors and businessmen and whatnot, they strike a deal with their own monarch, Louis XIV in France. Louis would be happy to send in his French army to control Spain because he's going to be able to control Spain, so it's a win for him. But during this, the French landowners and investor class, they basically demand that he get something for them out of this deal. And the deal he eventually gets is that their French merchant businesses are going to be able to send boats into the Spanish colonies, or at least be able to access Seville and Cadiz, and to get their boats in there so that they can trade with the official boats coming out of the Americas at the House of Trade. So this is what the French are really achieving for themselves. And we've seen before in the 1600s that the French have been trying to break into the Brazilian markets for years and years. But this is the opportunity they take to break into the Spanish Empire's markets. And of course, once they get in, they start not just doing it officially and paying their taxes, just like everyone else. The French want to get in, and they're going to start bribing Spanish government officials to look the other way at smuggling and to allow a lot of goods to move through into the American colonies without being taxed. So that's what smuggling basically achieves for a lot of these French companies. They pay a small bribe to, or maybe even a big bribe, to a lot of these Spanish government officials, and they make even more profit because they don't have to pay an even larger amount in taxes. So French smuggling starts to grow out of control, and of course this is wartime. The Spanish government, even before the war started, they didn't really have the resources or the men and the soldiers or tax collectors to really control their American trade, their trade in the American colonies. So, and that was even in peacetime. Once the war breaks out, now Spain has to raise an army to, fight off possible invaders and fight on battlefields and whatnot, and defend their colonies from being attacked and conquered away from them. That just means that the Spanish government has even less opportunity, or even less ability to oversee their trade markets and control them. So during the war, for a good 11 years, this French smuggling just grows completely out of control. And there's virtually nothing that the Spanish can do to slow it down, or much less stop it. So smuggling does a lot of damage to the colonial markets, the colonial economies. Because the smuggling is bringing all these illegal goods in, which means that they can be sold for lower prices in the American colonies because they don't have to pay that tax that would cause the price to artificially rise. And that means that these smuggled goods are entering the American markets, and now they're being sold at even lower prices than before, which does a lot of damage to the colonial manufacturers, the obraje owners, who were dependent on any European goods coming into the market having to pay that tax so that their prices would be higher on the shelves. So the Europeans, especially the French, are just undercutting the colonial local producers even more, and driving them into bankruptcy during the war. And eventually a peace treaty is signed to end that war, becomes known as the Peace of Utrecht in 1713, and this does several big important things for the long term. Number one, this French guy who was put on the Spanish throne, he is officially declared the King of Spain for the long term. The only rule that he really has to follow is that he cannot combine his monarchy with the French monarchy. His monarchy has to be new and has to be completely separate from France forever. So this Bourbon family that Philip is a part of will still run France. That's what the Bourbons will mainly do for the next 100 years or so. But this kind of offshoot of the Bourbon family, Philip, who's now running Spain as Spain's king, he's going to start his own family, basically, his own line of kings for Spain, and that Spanish line can never be combined with the French line. So that's put into the treaty and still holds today. Another thing that the treaty does is the English were one of the big winners of the War of the Spanish Succession. Obviously, they got what they want in separating the two lines of the Bourbon family. So that was one of England's big goals. Another of their big goals is to get into the fleet system. So the English get a guarantee that their companies can get involved with the fleet system on a fairly limited basis at first. And of course, they're going to kind of smuggle their way into scaling this up over the years. But this is where England gets access, their very first access legally into the American colonial markets. And so they're going to get involved in smuggling eventually, and it's going to make it even worse and worse over the years. And they're going to get even more contracts to do even more trade, and especially one of the big ones in this treaty is that the treaty will force Spain to sell contracts to English companies to import African slaves, up to 4,800 slaves per year into the Americas. And of course, the English will pay bribes to Spanish colonial officials to import even more slaves. And this increased English smuggling becomes kind of a joke in the Spanish government and in the colonies, to the point where Spain will try to clamp down on some of it in the 1730s, and then will start even another war between Spain and England in 1739 that will go through the 1740s, but we don't really have the time to get into the details of that. But we see this is how England is getting into this system. So by the early 1700s, Spain has lost really all control that it had over the American markets, over its empire, and it's increasingly having to allow, especially England and France, allow their companies into the markets, into the system. And that's really the cost that Spain had to pay in order to keep their guy on his throne. Philip V, now that he's kind of solidly in the throne, he looks to consolidate power in Iberia as much as possible. He basically eliminates what used to be the independent kingdom of Aragon. This is where the official merger of Castile and Aragon happens in 1714 under his leadership, which basically eliminates the Aragon government and just makes it all one big Spanish government. And then by doing that, he also takes over Catalonia, which is way in the northeast of Iberia, because Catalonia had joined with Aragon as an official part of the Aragon kingdom in 1705. So this is Philip V really taking direct control over virtually all of Iberia, except for the little sliver to the west, which is Portugal, and continues to survive as a fairly independent kingdom. And Philip isn't done there. He's going to start trying to reform the colonial government, because his advisors start telling him quickly after he's on the throne, after the war is over especially, the colonial government is not working very well. So we need to start making some big changes to kind of update its efficiency, update its tax collection, and make sure that the government is really benefiting off of all this trade, and eventually try to kind of clamp down on the smuggling and get rid of it as much as they possibly can. So in 1717, he's going to announce a kind of major series of legal reforms to the colonial governance, really. One of the first big ones is to relocate the House of Trade from Seville to Cadiz. And we talked about that earlier. So that happens also in 1717. The next big one is that he appoints an official one guy to run the Indies, the colonies. So this one guy becomes known as the Secretary of State for the Indies. Again, he's appointed at first in 1717, and he really took all the administrative and military power away from the old Council of the Indies that's been around for a couple hundred years by then. So basically figuring that one guy would have much more authority to run the thing than having a commission that would have to debate policy and whatnot. The one guy could just implement policy and make changes. The council was still around, but they largely become kind of a judicial system for appeals under the law. So they become a kind of court system more than anything for the long term after the Secretary of the State comes in to run the direct administration. The king will also create an investigative system and appoint investigators, internal kind of police, basically, internal auditors, to dig through the tax system for the colonies and try to identify inefficiencies, fraud, and whatnot, and eliminate them. So they're not just tasked with finding what's going on or what's going wrong, but to make major proposals to eliminate those problems and bring all the trade back above board, basically make it kind of open and sanctioned by government, basically to try to eliminate smuggling and whatnot as much as they possibly can. They find a lot of inefficiencies, but for the long term are very unable to eliminate them, really because of corruption. Because these investigators, these auditors, can make recommendations to the council or even to the Secretary of State, but those recommendations just aren't followed. Because up until about the year 1750 or so, the Spanish government is so desperate for cash that they sell offices still. They sell the office of Secretary of State to the highest bidder, or even offices on the Council of the Indies to the highest bidder, even the judgeships in the system, to make some short-term money for the government. The problem, though, is once you sell that office to somebody, they're going to start using that office to make the money back that they made the original purchase to get into office in the first place. So it's very similar kind of corruption problem that we saw in an earlier lecture involving the colonies themselves. So a lot of these kind of fraud and smuggling problems are not kind of dealt with. They're identified and recommended how to deal with them, but those recommendations are not put into effect until about after the year 1750 or so, when the Spanish government stops selling those offices and you start getting more kind of objective, good government types trying to get into those positions. And once they get in and they don't have a reason to be corrupt so much, they'll start to implement those changes as much as they can. So after about 1750 especially, they're going to start implementing better tax collection systems. And the first few steps at that better tax collection system was started in 1717. Before that year, before 17, the government would sign contracts with local companies to collect the government taxes. So that was always a disaster, because a local company would they would basically be a government contractor to collect the taxes. So the company is making money. They're charging the government a fee to do that service. But since the government is so far away from the colonies, and now you have a private company collecting taxes, this is where you have a lot of these, private company employees taking bribes to allow smuggling and fraud to go on a massive scale. And so finally, this kind of reform system set up in 1717 stopped selling contracts to private companies to collect the taxes, and will set up an official government tax collection system in the colonies. So the first big instance of that happens in Lima, the capital city of the Peruvian Viceroyalty, in 1724. And that was so successful that they'll start to expand that government tax collection system. Government employees basically will start collecting the taxes instead of a private company's employees. And that'll be expanded into New Spain in the 1750s. So that will, even though you have to hire more government employees to go out and collect the taxes, they collect so much more money because they're supposed to be doing it fairly objectively, because they have their government salary that they're set up with, so they're happy. So they don't need to take bribes to turn a profit for themselves. But you have more government employees that are being paid, but the amount of taxes that they're actually collecting on a daily basis skyrockets. So the government makes more money off of tax collection, even though they have more employees to pay, just because, again, the tax collection is more efficient. And Spain also will start to extend licenses for other groups to go to different regions in the colonies. So basically, ships and captains will get contracts to go to different colonial ports. They don't just have to go to the one in Lima, or the one in off the coast of Mexico City, or the official ones in any of the colonial or Caribbean islands. So Spain will start expanding the amount of ports that ships could go to and get involved in colonial trade. So in theory, that would expand the amount of trade going on, which would, again, in theory, be really good for the overall colonial economy. The downside for it is not only do colonial ships get to go to different ports now, as long as they have this government contract permission to allow them to do so, but also European ships could come from outside of the colonies and land in different ports. And that means a lot of European goods are now starting to enter a lot of different places in the colonial markets. Which, again, European goods are generally better made, they're better quality, and they're mass produced much faster and cheaper in Europe, so they can also be sold for lower prices in the American colonies. Which, again, causes a price collapse for certain goods that the Europeans can import into the Americas. And again, the groups that are really hurt by this are the colonial producers that were trying to make those products in a local obraje. So when the price just collapses of those goods, those obraje owners are basically bankrupted. So a lot of the obraje owners and other colonial producers themselves, they start writing messages and complaining to the government saying, we want you to bring back the fleet system and restrict trade again, because that had raised prices to the point where we can profit and stay in business. But the government never listens to them. So trade keeps expanding because the government likes the fact that the volume of trade is growing, even if prices take a dip, because trade expands so much that the government can collect more taxes. So the government's making money off of expanded trade. And the lower prices benefited a lot of consumers, a lot of people going to the market to buy something, because now they can buy more goods with the same money because the price of each individual good has gone down. So it's really the local producers that are most upset by this, and a lot of other groups seem to be making out very well on the expanded trade, the expanded kind of port system. And because of the expanded trade in all these new areas that the government is allowing ships to go to, that kind of kick-starts their economy again and gets economic growth going in those diverse ports all over the place. Because now you have more goods being bought and sold, you have more ships coming in, you have that increased traffic needs more workers to deal with the traffic, needs more tax collectors, needs more restaurants, needs a bigger harbor for all the boats coming in. So there's more jobs, there's more economic activity going on in more places in the empire. So the Spanish government was a big fan of doing this. And another big development for Spain's colonies in the very late 1600s and early 1700s is that the colonies just start to grow. The Spanish government started to get very worried that a lot of its European competitors, especially the English, the French, the Dutch, and even the Russians, coming down from the kind of Pacific Northwest, way up by Alaska, and starting to, their Russian traders are moving down the Pacific coastline and coming down as far into what is today California. That really worried a lot of the Spanish government because they're afraid that these Europeans are starting to kind of encroach on the edges of the Spanish Empire. So what the Spanish government started to do in the late 1600s is to start expanding its empire further and further north up into areas that are today the United States. So some of the first attempts are to start founding forts up into present-day Arizona and New Mexico in the 1680s and 1690s. So Santa Fe, New Mexico becomes one of the, if not the earliest major fort kind of European settlement in all of what would become eventually the United States. So it's the first permanent settlement by a European power. And they're doing this to expand their northern border as far as they possibly can to control more territory, to create a kind of buffer zone between any Europeans that are moving south, getting closer to their kind of home empire in New Spain. The Spanish will also start developing a series of forts and kind kind of conflicts with other European powers that are moving into the Gulf coastline, especially around New Orleans, because the French are starting to build a colony that they're going to call Louisiana, which they name after their King Louis. So New Orleans is kind of a center of French interest to try to build a colonial power on the mainland. And the Spanish will start getting in arguments with the French over who owns that coastline type area, and especially going further east from New Orleans into what is today Florida, kind of this northern coastline of present-day Florida in Pensacola Bay. There's a lot of conflict between the Spanish and the French about who owns that territory and who is going to develop settlements, and that convinces the Spanish to start a colony at St. Augustine in the early 1700s. So that's one of the earliest kind of forts or cities that gets founded in what is today Florida. The Spanish will also start building a series of forts and missions and settlements in modern-day Texas in the 1720s. So the one at San Antonio and largely along the coastline. So we consistently see the Spanish again pushing their borders further and further north to deal with what they fear is a long-term European encroachment on their colonies. So overall, the early 1700s, under this new king Louis V, or Philip V, and his new government, they're very conscious of a lot of the problems of colonial governance, and they're starting to try to take actual step-by-step policies to deal with those problems. And those policies grow into a kind of large-scale, kind of consistent government study and government action. So the government is trying to deal with the problems that are happening all over the place on a consistent kind of rational basis, rather than the older kind of piecemeal ad hoc method that the Spanish government had used in the 15 and 1600s to deal with problems kind of as they popped up in different places. So this is a new type of era for Spanish governance over its colonies. And now we'll get into kind of evolution of the Brazilian economy in the early 1700s. And the biggest impact on Brazil is really that gold is discovered in the Brazilian interior, further away in this greenish area, away from the coastline a little bit in the 1690s. And that obviously motivates a whole lot of gold seekers to go into those areas to prospect for gold and lay claim to land to try to enrich themselves. So that will push the Brazil's population to grow and to grow into new areas. So Brazil will start to colonize new territories further and further inland for about the next 50 years or so through the 1740s. So the Brazilian economy will be increasingly reliant on gold and silver as those mines get going in the early 1700s. But the sugar economy is still the backbone and the most profitable source of investment in Brazil well into the late 1700s. Even though gold and silver are growing as a part of the Brazilian economy, sugar is still the overwhelming kind of driver of the Brazilian economy in this era. And one big development we get is that the capital city is relocated from Santiago down to Rio de Janeiro. So that will become the new Brazilian capital in this era in the early 1700s. And Rio is still, to this day, the most biggest population and still the one of the kind of biggest central trading hubs in Brazil, even this moment. So the gold discoveries push population growth, and of course a lot of the kind of gold prospectors, they try to get as much land as they possibly can under their own control, and they're going to have so much land very often that they're going to import more slaves, which requires more food and more kind of housing and more clothing and more resources. So the gold boom in the early 1700s in Brazil really pushes a lot of Brazil's economic development, a lot of economic growth. And in general, Brazil's population will double from 1 million in the year 1700 to about 2 million in the year 1800. So Brazil is starting to grow by leaps and bounds by this point. The gold boom will start to decline after the year 1750. So a lot of the, especially the slaves that had been put into the gold mines, they're largely relocated out of the gold mines as the kind of gold investment or mine investment slows down after the year 1750, and those slaves will largely be relocated or repurposed back into the sugar plantations. So the Brazilian colony will add more provinces and more territories in the early 1700s, and those new territories will need some kind of government oversight, so they'll set up a kind of administrative building with kind of police and tax collectors. They'll have to set up a court system to keep society functioning. So this brings a lot of development to Brazil into new places that they haven't really touched yet. And again, the Portuguese government is looking to make as much money off of these gold discoveries and this increasing population. So these areas where people are going to mine for gold have very high tax rates, especially on the gold and silver that they were extracting. So the cost of living in the mining areas was fairly high because of government taxation and government attempts at controlling the area, often through monopolies and the attempt to stop smuggling and whatnot. So most of the kind of prospectors who come into the new areas into Brazil were largely Portuguese colonists or African slaves that they brought with them. So Brazil will import well over 1 million African slaves in the 1700s, which is pretty much the tipping point that makes slavery the backbone of the whole Brazilian economy in that century and beyond. Again, most of the newly imported African slaves went into the gold and silver mines until their decline started in the 1750s, and then they're kind of moved back out into the sugar plantations. So by about the year 1800, slaves were really the biggest proportion of the Brazilian population. So they're probably about 38% of the whole population of the entire colony. Whereas free Africans and mulattoes, kind of mixed race, they're about 28% of the Brazilian population by the year 1800. The so-called white people of Portuguese descent were about an equal 28%, and natives were only about 6% of the colonial population. So African slaves, forced laborers, were the biggest proportion of the entire colonial economy, which could, look like a possibly bad thing if those slaves ever started a massive uprising. They could do a lot of damage, and of course the mulattoes and the Portuguese landowners were very afraid of that on a constant basis. The mining boom also brought a lot of poor immigrants into Brazil and into these new territories that are being colonized because they're looking to get rich. And that created a lot of big social problems because you get a mixture in these new territories that are being colonized between a lot of kind of gold rush immigrants that have very low education levels and very little experience with government responsibility. They're not looking to be governed, basically. They're looking to get out there and get as much gold as they possibly can. And as the Brazilian colonial government tries to really govern those areas and set up administration and police and tax collectors and court systems, a lot of those more highly educated government leaders will come into contact with people that they consider to be kind of uncultured, uneducated, and really below them. So you get a lot of kind of social argument as the elite really deride and make fun of these immigrants that they think are kind of dirtier and lower class and whatnot. And that kind of eventually breaks out into an open conflict between the lower class immigrants, the poor immigrants, and the elite government officials that becomes known as, embobos means tenderfeet, which means workers who have shoes, who do government jobs, who aren't like the hard manual laborers. So the embobos are really the kind of government officials who look down on these, what they say are lower class, dirtier workers. And that eventually breaks out into a conflict for about a year between the government elite and the investment elite, the investor class, who live the good life. And the manual laborers who are out there, digging away at the ground, and they don't like being made fun of. So there's a lot of class conflict in the colonies. The kind of experienced money managers and investors, as they go into these areas, they look to invest in land, especially during the gold boom. But the investor class, they largely keep to themselves. They don't want to marry their children with a lot of the manual laborers because those manual laborers are poor. The investor class, who are looking to manage money and increase their profit for the long term, they'll marry their families into other investor merchant families because they're all rich. So they're looking to kind of diversify their family contacts. So just as we've seen in Europe in previous lectures, the investor class, if I'm a father and I have, 4 or 5 kids, I'm going to want to make sure that one of my kids will kind of inherit the family business and run it. I want to get another kid maybe into the Catholic Church so that my family has some kind of access to the church bureaucracy and have some influence. I'll try to get another kid into the government, into the tax collection system or the government administration, so my business, my family has a voice there. And maybe another kid I'll try to intermarry with another merchant business so we can merge our businesses together for the long term. So a lot of these merchant families, these elite families, are very, very careful about who they're intermarrying with because marriage is a kind of business alliance. And the professions that your children go into are very well planned out. To try to basically diversify your family's power. So these kind of investor classes or even these middle classes have to be very careful in who they're making deals with, and they usually look to keep their families away from the lower class because they don't have money, they don't have access to any level of power. And there's also generally a lot of racism floating around. So the investor class does not want to intermarry with anyone that has maybe a questionable racial background. So there's a lot of kind of racism going around and a lot of discrimination going around, and the elite are trying to keep among themselves for the long term. And the Brazilian colony invested really very little in education or building schools or training or anything like that. So the underclass, the hard manual labor class, they have very little opportunity to rise out of that kind of impoverished background. They don't have schools they can go to get the training to move into government or some other kind of bureaucracy to get better jobs, and they have a very hard time intermarrying with the wealthier or even middle class kind of business families. So if you're kind of born into poverty in these types of colonies, it's very difficult to escape that poverty, to pull your way out of there. All right, so that's some of the problems going on in the kind of gold boom areas in the early 1700s. But diamonds are also discovered even further into the interior of Brazil in the 1720s. And we don't even know the exact date or even the year that diamonds were discovered in the 1720s. We're pretty sure it happened that decade, but the miners who discovered the diamonds, they conspired to keep that information among themselves so that they can mine the diamonds out as much as they possibly can and smuggle them out without paying taxes, and then get them on boats and kind of ship them around and sell the diamonds little by little in different markets around the world, without paying taxes. And they're actually pretty successful at that for a few years. So historians estimate that they smuggled out a massive quantity of diamonds into the European markets by the year 1730. Their problem, though, is that they didn't have the discipline to only sell a few diamonds at a time, month after month, in the European markets. Once they got into the European markets, they just flooded the market with all these new diamonds, which crashed the diamond prices, which really is never a good idea. And something that diamond sellers have learned from today. The big diamond companies in the world, they keep their mass supply of diamonds in vaults, heavily guarded vaults around the world, and they only trickle a little bit out per year to put into the market in order to keep that price of diamonds very, very high as they can drive it. Because they know if they just empty out the vaults and just throw all the diamonds on the market, that the prices would go down very quickly. But obviously the kind of diamond smugglers in the 1720s hadn't learned that lesson yet. The government was very upset with those smugglers when the government finally found out what was going on in the 1730s, and the government first outright banned all diamond production, all diamond extraction in all of Brazil, and then tried to sell monopolies to individual companies to go into specific areas and mine for diamonds. So the government really tries to control diamond production as much as it possibly can, but most historians estimate that that was just an outright failure because there's just too much money to be made. So a lot of individuals took the risk of secretly going into these areas and started mining secretly for diamonds and trying to smuggle them out if they can, because there's so much money to be made off of them. But the taxes on those monopolies and on diamond extraction generally funded a lot of local government operations in these newly colonized areas. So court systems, government administration, police, tax collectors, those types of things. And that really helped to diversify the economies of these newly colonized areas because there's a government structure in place which requires some amount of educated elites to be in the area to run the government, which means there's more housing, there's more food that needs to be produced in the area to feed not just the miners but the kind of government overseers. And that needs to develop a trading network because these areas are all inland, so there's more transportation. You need to build more wagons, you need to hire more workers and guards to transport the goods back and forth. So the Brazilian economy starts to diversify as a result of these diamond discoveries in the early 1700s, getting into the mid-1700s. So that helped the general economic development of Brazil. And so we've talked about this lecture, the general economic development of all the three different major colonies, New Spain, Peru, and Brazil through the 16 and early 1700s up until about the year 1750 or so. And in the next lecture, we'll talk much more about even bigger government reforms that Spain and Portugal try to implement in these colonies to make these colonies as efficient as possible. We'll talk about those effects next time.